Hey, this is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries. Welcome to the Human Things Podcast, Season 3, Episode 5, I believe.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
So much to get to this week, so much to cover. First of all, I don't even know if a moment of silence is necessary. I think more, let's call it a moment of she's gone. Hall & Oates is officially broken up. We talked about I feel like this, of the things that we've done on this show, there's been almost a saga with Hall & Oates, right? Originally, I defended them and their ability to put together a 3-track set that would match anybody. Was received feedback from people that had never heard the song "She's Gone" before, and were texting me and letting me know it's a banger, man. It's a great song. It is. "She's Gone" is just a great song. But then we shared a few months ago that Daryl Hall had signed a restraining order against John Oates, and now it's official. Hall & Oates is over. So whatever's appropriate for the producers to add to this moment, the vibe. You get, and there's things that it's not just "She's Gone," which is a great song. Shortly after we talked about Hall & Oates here, and I'm not trying to claim that we made Hall & Oates cool. Our audience isn't that big, but I am saying after we talked about Hall & Oates, suddenly Rich Girl, I don't know if you saw the image of him.
You're a rich girl and you're gone too far, 'cause you know it don't matter anyway.
Daryl Hall singing "Rich Girl." I think it might be on Saturday Night Live. He's got his guitar, a big fur coat, and these big old 70s sunglasses on. And it is a vibe. It is a feel. It is a mood. It is something. And so it's gone. It's over. So that's one thing. Number 2 on the list of catching up with things from the past. We had talked at some point about the escalation of tensions between the animal kingdom and the kingdom of man, so to speak. And the orcas in the Straits of Gibraltar that were assaulting sailboats, and they were dismantling the rudder. That was the extent to which it went. And a single pod, a 15 whale pod, or dolphin. I mean, they're technically dolphins. A 15 orca pod run by a matriarch named Gladis. And there's confusion as to whether or not Gladis and this pod were playing, whether this was some new type of play, or whether or not they're angry about something to do with sailboats. They sank one. Gladis's pod sank a sailboat recently. The escalation has happened now, and we're talking. I joke about this because it is fascinating because orcas have generational knowledge and they teach their young to do the things that they've been doing, and it becomes something ingrained in particular orca communities. If you study orcas even a little bit, you'll find out that orcas eat different things. They have different menu items all around the world because this orca group that lives in this area taught their young to eat this, and this orca group over here in that area taught their young to eat that, and they differ and their hunting methods can differ from orca region to orca region, or like the regions that they live within. And so the idea that Gladys is now raising a pod of orcas to attack sailboats is interesting because we don't know how long it's going to go. We don't know what the escalation looks like. There is one thing that ought to be said every time we talk about something, we're talking about orcas, is that orcas only eat what is on their menu, and we are not on their menu. To the best of my knowledge, orcas just don't kill human beings in the wild. We have a couple of times where they've killed people in captivity, I think 3, but they don't kill human beings in the wild, and they don't eat human beings. We're not on their menu, and they're very picky eaters. They only eat what's on their menu, which, by the way, is true of a lot of things. Sharks don't eat us. Great whites attack human beings. They tend to bite them and then let them go. Same with bull sharks. I'm starting to just assume that we just don't taste good. I mean, I know we don't have enough meat to satisfy most animals. Let's just take a grim turn here and then get off of this altogether. Because we've suddenly got into the idea of whether human beings taste good or not. One of the most interesting or weird articles that I've seen over the last couple of months, and I've seen it 2 or 3 times, is someone who has made the case that, and this is people who do the wellness checks. So there's a reason to believe that someone inside the house has died, and they go into the house to find them, to verify it. They said, a little warning, if you know, your cat will eat you. Yeah, that is, they said, your cat will eat you. Your dog will not, but your cat will. And this is not somebody just speculating that doesn't like cats. This is somebody, they don't like cats, by the way, but they don't like cats because of this, because of their experience on wellness checks when people have been dead for some times. It is almost universally true that the cats begin to eat their owners and the dogs do not. So your cat will eat you if you die. Cat person, be aware. And you may like that because cat people love to talk about how independent their cats are. Dogs are subservient. Our cats are independent. We have to earn their love. Dogs just give it to them free, which, by the way, is why I love dogs. I mean, I love cats too, but I love the fact that my dogs are so happy to see me. I am very aware that I am not the most agreeable person that ever lived on the face of the planet. And I know that I rub some people the wrong way. So when I go home and I know that all I have to do is to look at my dogs and say, you guys want to go for a walk? And they are going to gush affection and love for me. That's what they need from me. They need me to walk them around the neighborhood a couple of times. And then they just adore me and love me, feed me, walk me, tell me you love me. I've mentioned before in this show that I love the fact that dogs' heart rates accelerate when you tell them that you love them. I think that's amazing. But I love cats too. I'm an animal lover, but it's just a fact. Cats will eat you. Sharks will bite you and spit you out. Orcas won't eat you at all. Your cat will. Yeah, that's a great way to start the show today, I think. I think we've done some we could stop it right there, and I feel like we've done some good work. All right, so moving on to another thing that I thought, and this is just, and there will be a graphic sharing this with you so that you can see the quote. I've blacked out the name of the person because I'm just not a doxer. I'm just not in the interest of going after people online. But recently I've been watching John Oliver, and we talked about him on the last episode, was it that we talked about? So we talked about him at Lincoln, and I thought about getting more from him about this particular thing, but I don't want this to become the John Oliver show where Jay just responds to John Oliver all the time. But he did a whole show talking about conservatives seeking to remove books from public libraries. And on that show, he was obviously, I think John Oliver is basically like the highest level of trolling that you can get. I've come to that opinion of him. I think he's funny. I don't think all trolls are not funny. I actually think some internet trolls are funny. I think John Oliver is like the peak trolling, right? He actually is kind of funny sometimes. He's got a better accent than most trolls. I like the way he does his thing for the most part, even though he's full of disinformation and he tells people things out of context. I like him. He's just the most advanced troll there is out there. And he was ripping on conservatives for having concerns about what's in libraries. And I think sometimes those concerns, I am a free speech guy. I'm all for free speech. I don't like book banning. It's not my thing. But I do think that there's age-appropriate information that ought to be filed in the right place. But here's the thing, and here's the thing I would defend about those people. As a free speech guy, I think that everybody has the right to petition when they have a grievance. Now, if that petition is rejected, then they move on or they continue to fight. But that you don't take matters into your own hands. That's the way society works. And we're going to be talking a lot about that today, I think, in other realms as well. We live in a society, as George Costanza would say. We live in a society. We live in a place with rules where we're expected to behave. And to be angry with conservatives for taking their grievances to the proper channels and seeing if they can get them addressed in a socially acceptable format, I think is ridiculous. It's free speech. People are free to pursue the things that they want to pursue. Even though I don't like particularly book banning, if somebody has that issue and they want to go and bring it forth, knock yourself out. As long as you're willing to live with whatever the decision is. And if you aren't, then you can keep addressing it as long as you need to feel like you need to address it. But that is your prerogative. I'm not going to be animated by everything that everyone else is animated, just like I know that other people aren't going to be impassioned by the things that make me passionate. But I support your right to pursue those things. But what has been interesting is online there has been a theme that only conservatives or MAGA or right wing or whatever they want to call you want to ban books. Now, this is what I think is interesting. Threads, Zuckerberg desperately wants me to start using Threads. And I can't figure out any reason to do it. But if you're on Instagram, and Instagram is probably the social media I'm on more than anything else. I try not to spend a ton of time on anything, but mostly I'm on Instagram because I do a lot of lacrosse stuff on Instagram for my daughter. So I'll make videos for her, or even some of her teammates, to put them out there just because I enjoy lacrosse and it helps me to interact with technology and helps me to see what builds audiences. And I can use it to help me in this area as well. What I learned there can be applied over here. So I'm on Instagram more than I'm on anything. And they give you these little thread encouragement things to get on thread. They'll show you threads. Now, Threads, if you're not familiar, is the response to X, which used to be called Twitter. So when everyone wanted to flee because they were mad that Elon Musk took it over and that he was going to remove all of the filters or the things that were keeping people from posting things, or the editing or the censoring, or however you want to look at what was going on, they needed a place to run, and Zuckerberg gave it to them in the form of Threads. Why I'm not interested in Threads is because, as near as I can tell, the reason that Threads exists more than anything is so that you can rip on Elon Musk, J.K. Rowling, and who else? Let's see. I know Musk and J.K. Rowling. Donald Trump, obviously. I mean, they love to rip on Trump as well. But J.K. Rowling all the time, and Elon Musk almost all the time. And then it's kind of like the person of the week. Whoever made them angry this week, they're going to rip on that person as well. And so, to make a long story even a little longer. So the threads come up and I see them, and I see them ripping on different things. All you're doing is convincing me that it's just as stupid as X, formerly known as Twitter. And I just have no interest in this format of social media, right? It just does nothing for me. It's weaponized concision. It's trying to be as cruel or as mocking as you can be in the shortest number of characters, and the people that succeed at it tend to be people who apparently show a talent for being cruel and ugly in a very short format. And people love them and applaud them. So this thread comes up about somebody complaining about the book Hillbilly Elegy, how they hate Hillbilly Elegy, how angry they are that it made the author famous. And as they were going, and I'm not really interested in getting into that. I've read Hillbilly Elegy, but one of them says this: "Call me a bad librarian, but I took that book off my shelves, withdrew it, and threw it straight into the garbage." To which somebody responded, "The recycling bin was right there." And her response to that was, "No, but I was making a statement by putting it in the trash. Also, recycling over here doesn't take books anymore." So one reason I don't want to put her name out there is because she may be lying. I mean, it is online. People lie about things all the time. Can't even verify that she's actually a librarian. But that's the kind of thing that they all think is funny and they laugh about, right? But here's the thing that I find frustrating. This, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about T.S. Eliot today in other formats, but T.S. Eliot in his book, Christianity and Culture, says paganism holds all the most valuable advertising space. Now, he makes the case in his book, Christianity and Culture, that it's not Christianity versus secularism, it was Christianity versus paganism. And he makes his case, I think, fairly convincingly, a case that is extended by social scientist Christian Smith in his book, To Flourish or Destruct, where he takes that theme and runs with it to demonstrate that T.S. Eliot was actually right, that neo-paganism is more what's going on than a secular society. You see this also in the book Strange Rites, where they talk about that as you see this movement away from organized religion, you're not seeing them fleeing towards secularism and non-religious. They're going towards different kinds of worship. Different things have become their focus. But even at the most basic place, the elevation and worship of yourself, the elevation of worship of nature, the elevation of worship of markets, and all these different things, T.S. Eliot said, this is paganism, this isn't secularism. And paganism holds all the most valuable advertising space. This goes back to what we've heard for years. I remember my kids reading Philip Johnson's book, Defeating Darwinism, where in there, and I don't want to get into that right now because that's a different argument, but in there he talks about the idea of the megaphone and this idea of who owns the megaphone, who owns the culture, who owns the ability to speak their view into the world with the least number of impediments and with the most powerful platform. And T.S. Eliot's point is he wrote this back in 1939 during the peak of the Nazi powers, where he said, Paganism holds all the best advertising spaces. Paganism owns it. And as Christians who are trying to speak a Christian culture into existence, live a Christian culture within these societies, we have to recognize that the most valuable platforms for the transmission of information to the next generation are owned by people who disagree with us. Getting this back to the whole book banning thing and the hysteria over people who are saying, oh, the Christians want to book ban, or right-wing people, or MAGA, and all, they want to ban books. Some of them do. And they're going through the proper channels to try to get it done, and they're putting political pressure. But this person is talking about the kind of thing that's even more dangerous. They don't like the content of J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, and what is their response? Not to go through proper channels, but to abuse their power as a librarian to remove it. Now, even if that's not what actually happened, which is why I wouldn't share who they are, they're joking about it, and they're not getting any blowback from the same people who are clutching their pearls and whining and screaming about other people trying to get books removed from the shelves. Why? Because they want that book removed from the shelf because they don't like the message in it, and they don't like the author. And it's funny. It's funny to censor them. Hysterical. It's a joke. To be laughed at and shared and to be liked. At the time that they posted that, let's say, call me a bad librarian. By the way, if you are a librarian, granted, you're a bad librarian. You win. You're a terrible, terrible librarian. You ought to be fired and lose your job for doing the thing that you just did. So, okay. But I took that book off my shelves, withdrew it, and threw it straight into the garbage. And on a post, this isn't some viral post. This isn't somebody who's a big celebrity, but they were commenting under somebody else's post and thread, and they got 128 likes or loves or hearts or whatever you want to say at the time that I saw this. And this was almost immediately after they said it. So like, I threw it away to the applause of the same people who are so apoplectic about the idea of conservatives trying to remove things from the book. But at least those conservatives that they hate are going through the proper channels and trying to do it in a socially acceptable way. We live in a society, as George Costanza would say, so act appropriately, please. That's the kind of thing that's dangerous. Not petitioning your local boards. That's the kind of thing that's dangerous. The people we can't control that can make decisions for us. I remember talking to an editor of a magazine at one point when I wrote an article about freedom of speech. And he said he didn't like freedom of he said he did not like the unqualified approach to freedom of speech that I took. He told me there are some things that are just too dangerous to be shared. And I told him, I understand what you think and I understand why you think what you think. But let me respond with this back to you. I don't want you or anybody else deciding what's too dangerous for me to hear. I don't want there to be somebody out there whose job it is to decide what I'm adult or not adult enough to hear. What news I am adult or sophisticated enough to understand and what news I'm not. I want the ability to make those decisions for myself. As a matter of fact, in a free society, I think it's absolutely necessary. And if you're worried I'm going to read Mein Kampf and become a Nazi, then I appreciate the high opinion you have of me and of your fellow citizens. But let's just assume that we can also read crazy and see crazy. Now, if you're worried because you see so many people online doing things, and I wish there's been a few articles in my life that I read and didn't save, and I'm angry that I didn't save it, and I didn't save it in some capacity. Years ago, I read an article that was written by somebody who made the case that 15 to 18% of the population at any given moment just believes wildly insane things, crazy things. And that's helpful. That's helpful information. And they supported it with a lot of different things where they could say, look at the polling. In any particular issue where we poll somebody, 15 to 18% of the population is not just ignorant, but apparently crazy. I mean, just absolutely crazy in their ability to completely and totally reject whatever it is that we understand as to be demonstrable reality, right? And I wish I had saved that article. That's one of those articles that I wish I had saved at the time because it is so helpful when you're talking about this sort of thing. You can't worry that 15% of the people believe something crazy. 15% of the people always believe something crazy because 15% of the population apparently just is crazy. And so that 15% may be here on one issue and here on another because there's no reason for them to have any, what's the word I'm looking for? Coherent worldview. They're just responding to things at any given moment with their emotion or with their fears or with their suspicions. And so I don't worry too much when we talk about freedom of speech that some people out there are crazy. What I worry about is society capable of sustaining? And if, by the way, we live in a society that is no longer capable of hearing the truth and being able to discern the truth from a lie, then you can hide everything all you want. We're doomed anyway. I mean, just as we're doomed if that's the truth about us. If we're just so childish and immature and incapable of actually thinking clearly and rationally, then blocking that information from us isn't going to help us. It's over. And we're just move on to something new. But that bothered me because I understood to a point the concerns that people have when they see other people trying to remove books. I get it because I love books. And I think even bad books should be available. By the way, most bad books will never get read if you don't talk about them. Nobody cares about them. It's freaking out about them and pointing to them that makes everybody buy them and gives them a life that extends beyond this moment of publication where they would just found themselves stuffed on some shelf in the back of a library somewhere, never to be touched by anybody and ultimately to be thrown away. But that doesn't bother me as much as this bothers me right here. That the same people who would be angry about someone saying that we should get rid of books that have content they agree with would joke about the fact that they have removed books from library shelves and thrown them away and get what amounts to internet applause from their followers for doing so. Yeah, let's just end it on this. You are absolutely right. You know who you are, and you are a bad, bad librarian. And you ought to be fired. 100% ought to be fired. All right. So there's that. So there's the Orcas. There is book banning. And here is it's really the last thing I want to talk about, right? It's just this, we'll talk about it at some length, but it's the last thing I want to talk about today. I've talked a lot about discussing just war theory. Why? First of all, why? I think that's a fair question. Why have I brought this up over and over again? And I have a college professor that I was going to bring on, and this will not be something that I drop and just never come back to again. So I wanted to discuss in some limited capacity the subject to start off. So why, first of all, would I care? Well, obviously I focus on abortion more than I focus on anything else because the moral cost of abortion is absurdly high. If you're wrong, we're killing 1 million human beings a year in the United States alone, 40 to 50 million worldwide. It's the number one cause of death worldwide every year. If we're wrong that the unborn do matter, if they are one of us, and we as a society are just letting them be destroyed, then it has a moral cost that is absent from almost everything else that you could possibly talk about. Short of, worldwide anarchy. I think anarchy is an evil worse than abortion. And if it happened, it would just be horrible. Then you would have all against all, as Thomas Hobbes talks about, like chapter 13 of Leviathan. The war of all against all, and that's more evil, more dangerous for the world than abortion. But it's difficult to find something when you talk about the numbers of abortion that rise to the level. So that's why we talk about it so much. As far as the level to which it rises, it's very difficult to find something that ever comes to that point. But I want to talk about just war theory because I've talked to so many people recently about war. Obviously, our nation is divided. I don't even know if that's true. I don't actually know the polling numbers. There is a faction of the nation right now that is very animated about what's going on in Israel with Gaza and the war. And there's good reason to be. Human beings are being destroyed. Lives are being lost. War is being waged. There's questions about whether that war is being waged ethically. And so just war theory became interesting to me because of the people in my life that came to me and were asking me questions about it. And in areas like this as well. Ukraine and Russia are still at war. Excuse me. Oh, man, I think I broke that. If you break your straw, it's the worst thing in the world, man. That may have been an exaggeration that was the worst thing in the world. That was hyperbole. It's not even, I'm talking about war, and then I talk about a broken straw. It's the worst thing in the world. Let's get some context. I know. I look at just and on balance, it's not. It's really superficial. All right. But I get questions, right? And I try to govern my reaction with things on whether or not I'm actually hearing questions. I have on this show and elsewhere repeatedly warned people, don't feel like you have to respond to everything that happens in the world on social media. Don't feel like you have to have something to say about everything. As a matter of fact, you shouldn't. You should wait. When you hear about something huge that's happening, you should take time and to try to gather information. But so why I wanted to talk about just war theory a little bit was just to get some background, because when we're talking about the concept of just war, we're introducing into discussion, as a man who believes himself to be a passionate Christian, I love Christ, and it is the greatest goal of my life to reflect Christ into the community around me. And at the same time, if I believe in some sort of just war theory, what I'm saying is that even though I have a job that advocates for the idea that all human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect, and that it is unjust to destroy innocent human life before it's born, that there are circumstances under which killing is the moral thing to do. Morally allowed, the moral action to stand against great evil through the action of war. And that's not something that we should take lightly as Christians. So I've got a whole stack of books, and we're going to keep addressing this here and there in bits and pieces. But I wanted to start the conversation today because I feel like over the last week, I've had far more conversations about what's going on in the world as far as war than I have with people about abortion. So there have been people in my life asking questions, and I have tried to answer in a way that would help them to process it. That's all I ever want to do. All the effort of what we do is help people to think through and process stuff. I'm not a huge advocate for politics. As a matter of fact, I will say, I want to take a moment and say this. As part of this conversation, I want to preface it with this. I consider myself to be following the model of Treebeard from The Lord of the Rings as far as how I see myself in today's political landscape in the United States. Treebeard had a line in the movies, and he says that I am on no one's side because nobody is on my side. I think that the tribalism that has taken root in the United States is destructive, and we'll get into how it affects the kind of thinking about these things in just a moment here. And so that doesn't mean that I don't vote, or that doesn't mean that I don't. As a matter of fact, I'm writing an article right now. I've written an article for the Christian Research Journal about government participation. I think it's called Christianity is Better, What Place for the Christian in a Post-Christian Political World. If you go to equip.org and look up Jay Watts, I think you should be able to find that one. That's me talking about being a Christian in the political reality of today. I'm writing another article for them on the idea of using your vote to limit evil. I'll be speaking about this elsewhere as well. So this is something that I've been thinking about, reading about, and talking about quite a bit. So I don't want it to sound like I'm not politically engaged. As a matter of fact, I'm writing articles and speaking out on the idea that we must be politically engaged. What it is my way of saying when I say I'm like Treebeard is that I'm not bogged down any longer in the idea that I am one group or another, that I see my role in this world is to reflect Christ and to stand against evil, to limit it as best I can. And so my votes or my participation in the government is done from that perspective, to create the best opportunity for good to flourish, to limit evil as best I can. If I can't do the first, I will do the latter. But when I say I am like Treebeard from The Lord of the Rings, I like the Ents and that idea of, look, I haven't decided yet where I fall on your side or their side, because as near as I can tell, none of y'all are on my side. And by my side, I mean none of you are serving the cause of Christ. You may be serving good or you may be limiting evil, but none of you wholesale are pursuing the kingdom of God on earth. And since that's my allegiance, then he gets my allegiance first, and everybody else gets evaluated with a bit of a wary eye. Let me see where you're coming from. Let me see what you're going to do. Right? Go back to a quote I heard from Reggie Jackson when I was younger, when he said, they asked him if he minded the people who hate him. He said, look, I was told when I was younger that a third of the people are going to hate you no matter what you do. A third of the people are going to love you no matter what you do. The other third are just waiting to see what you do. I'm in that last group. I'm just waiting to see what you do and to make judgments on that. So I wanted to preface my talk with that, to say that I don't see myself any longer as somebody that would ally themselves with one side, because I want to keep a wary eye on everybody to make sure that when I agree with you because you are in the cause of justice. Now, this is where just war theory actually becomes pretty helpful. Now, for today, we're going to talk about it in the terms of this book here, Just War Against Terror, by Jean Bethke Elshtain. I don't know if I pronounced, she's no longer with us. I was advised to get that book by scholars that I asked. I said, tell me a book that I should read. And this is just the first one we're going to talk about. I've read others now, but this is the first one they gave me. And I found this book so incredibly helpful about sorting through. Particularly, this book was written after the 9/11 attacks. So this was a woman who worked in this area that was trying her best to sort through for all of us in a very public forum the reasons that we should go to war if we were, and the kind of war that we're going to wage, and if, as a Christian, it was the right thing to do. And so the book, Just War Against Terror, The Burden of American Power in a Violent World, she talks about the justification for going to war. And just war theory goes back to Augustine. Side note, Augustine, Augustine, Augustina, Augustine. However, I read an entire academic article one time written about how to pronounce his name. And there's about 10 different ways that people from different parts of the world pronounce his name. The summation of the article was there is a right answer, but there's no way for us to know it. So pronounce it however you want to, right? I grew up, it was St. Augustine, but that was probably because the city is St. Augustine in Florida, and that was what I knew of the name. And then all of a sudden everybody started saying Augustine as if they were somehow pushing back against the Neanderthals that were calling him Augustine. And then I heard another guy say it's actually Augustina. And so I feel this is your permission to pronounce his name however you want from here on out. An academic article seeking to try to figure out how to actually accurately pronounce his name said his accurate pronunciation of his name is lost to history. You are not wrong if you say Augustine. You are not right if you say Augustine. You are not wrong or right if you say Augustina. There's just no way for us to know how he pronounced his name. So knock yourself out. So this goes back to Augustine, Augustina, where he talked about the idea of just war. And he starts to delineate the idea of what's acceptable for human beings as individuals and what's acceptable for the state. Looking at the scripture that says that God created states so that he could put the sword in their hand to bring justice. So there's a difference idea between how we look at that. I think that's 1 Corinthians 13, correct? Right after the love chapter, we go to the war chapter or the justice chapter. So I should have checked that before we did it, but I didn't plan on saying any of that. But so in this book, let's talk about a couple of things that I think are helpful in sorting these stuff out. Number one, she talks about 3 different ways to look at your engagement when state finds itself against state, when nation finds itself against nation. 3 broad categories about approaching these ideas. The first is pacifism. The second is realpolitik. And the third is just war theory. She said, let's get those 3 different categories in our head straight so that we can see that this is more than just how you would attempt to justify war. This is an entire way of understanding the legitimate role of a nation state in international politics, particularly when it comes to resistance to evil. She said, for the pacifists, the highest ideal is peace. Peace at all cost. So all of their understanding about the interactions between different countries is going to be aimed at the idea that we should seek peace above everything else. Now, there's lots of criticisms that could be leveled against this view. I think one of the most interesting things that was leveled in this book, or discussed, was the idea of the many different ways that peace can be achieved. For example, totalitarianism can establish peace. You can establish peace through totalitarianism. You can have such power over the people that live under you that you can forbid them and all others from interacting with violence. Is that something that most people are going to want? But if peace is the highest level of achievement, then how we reach peace is less important than if we reach peace. And so it's something to think about. Also, there's other things. I wrestled with pacifism when I was younger. Really. So when I first became a Christian, there was a period there where I genuinely wrestled with the idea of whether or not I thought the commands of Christ required us to be a pacifist. And there were several reasons why I ultimately did not land there. In the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, he talks about it a little bit. He shares a story, I think, about a ship with William Penn. And when they thought there were pirates coming, piracy is just a general term for people that would, rob what is not there from you on water. So there was a Quaker ship of pacifists. And he said that as the ship came and they couldn't identify it, the people who were sailing the ship for the Quakers said, all of you go down underneath. We will handle this. And as they were sending everyone down, and I can't remember his name, I'll have to check the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, but one of the Quakers told William Penn and everybody else on the ship, I'm going to stay up here with these guys who are going to defend us. So they all go underneath. As Benjamin Franklin shares the story, it was nothing. It was another ship. The captain knew him, saw him, just wanted to parlay for a moment. Just wanted to pull aside along, chat with a friend that he hasn't seen in a while. No threat. So they go back and open the hatch, whatever, call all the Quakers out so you can come. There's no danger. According to the story, I believe Franklin shares it, that William Penn came up and just laid into the Quaker gentleman who stayed up there with the people who were running the ship, who were managing the ship, who were going to protect them. Lays into them. You ought to have known better than to have been involved in violence. That's not our kind. That's not our way. According to, I believe, if I remember correctly, the response from him was, that's fair criticism. It's fair to question me. But I noticed you didn't question it and you didn't admonish me until after you knew you were safe. When I was going to lend a hand in protecting you while you were hiding out underneath and you believed you were in danger, you didn't raise this objection. You raised it when you knew you were safe. C.S. Lewis spoke at a pacifist society, and he said, and you can read this, I believe it's in God in the Docs, but you can find it if it's not. His speech to this pacifist society, he said, the freedom for you to morally judge those who go to war was bought and paid for and protected by those who were willing to die to protect liberty. You are given this freedom to stand in judgment and to take this position of moral superiority by the people who are willing to die to protect it. I cannot believe, as C.S. Lewis said, that is the morally superior position. If in order to hold it, you require others to fight to preserve it, to do what you won't do yourself, and what you believe by your very position makes you better than them. And it were these types of things that I read. And other things, one of the other things that stuck with me as I was considering pacifism was the idea that if all men of principle and women of principle, of Christian restraint, refuse to have anything to do with our armed forces, because out of principle we believe it is unchristian to be involved in warfare, then we leave the practice of warfare to those without any moral limits. If we believe that all ethical and moral people at their highest should not be involved in warfare and should pull themselves out of all institutions that practice or seek to restrain warfare, then we leave warfare to be fought to be executed by people with no moral limits. The idea that we would have an army without Christians who are willing to limit the evil that not just the other evil people, the evil forces in the world are trying to do to their own citizens, but to our own government would have us do. Without moral and ethical voices in there who are looking out for justice, we create an army that's going to be evil overnight, which gets us to realpolitik. As I said, I cannot be a pacifist because I multiple things left me in the position that we have to have moral people engaged in the art and execution of warfare. Without it, warfare would go unchecked. And the way that we practice it and execute it would be evil across the board. The concept of just war would be impossible because there would be no just agents within it. So then we look at realpolitik, and she says realpolitik is all about power, which means whatever gets the power is morally justified. You see this in Machiavelli's The Prince. My son just spent last semester reading The Prince, and my daughter, who's in England right now on her study abroad, is reading The Prince right now as well. My son hated The Prince because he hated this idea of politics as power. There's a lot of discussion, by the way, of whether or not Machiavelli intended The Prince to be satire as a book. That he didn't actually believe those things, but he wanted to use that as a demonstration of what's wrong with it. That's usually held because people can't possibly believe anybody would think this is a good idea, but some people do. And so in realpolitik, the ultimate is power. Peace, the ultimate. Pacifism, the ultimate is peace. Realpolitik, the ultimate is power. And whatever gets power, whatever establishes power, whatever is necessary to have power or dominion over evil forces is justified. It's justified because you have to have power over them, because that's the whole point of all of this, is the establishment and collection of power. I don't think anybody has any problem seeing the multiple problems with that one, or the issues that you would have with that particular view. It was a very popular view. It seemed to fall out of favor a little bit after World War II, because as we started to realize the extent to which the pursuit of power and the passage of positive law, the idea of making laws within a country, created Germany that was able to promote Nazism. And then when they came under trial, the Nazis' defense was, nothing we did was illegal. Everything that we did was legal within the framework of the German law. We followed the law as we were taught and the orders that were given to us by German leadership under German law. We violated no laws. You cannot prosecute us. You have no grounds to prosecute us. All we did was our duty to our home country. It isn't even necessary for us to say we agreed with what they were doing in the prosecution of their war or the destruction of other human beings, particularly, as a matter of fact, the Holocaust, obviously. So it doesn't matter because we were Germans doing what the German leadership told us to do under German law. And so we see, and Marianne Glendon talks about this in Rights Talk, is talked about in this book as well. And then Nigel Biggers talks about it and what's wrong with rights. You see at this point, the rest of the world saying, well, we can't just have the politics of power. There has to be some grounding of human rights that is established in these European constitutions. They were all driven by this sense of realpolitik, this idea of that we're moving towards this politics of power. And then it had to be abandoned, and we had to find some form of natural rights, some form of human dignity that legitimate governments like we had in the United States at the founding and the Declaration of Independence, the standards that said all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then if a government is not pursuing or the protection of those things for its citizenship, if it's abusing their right to life or their right to liberty, then that government is no longer legitimate. Because the legitimate role of government is to protect those rights that are pre-governmental, pre-constitutional. All human beings have them by virtue of what they are. That is a natural rights foundation that we can build into our Constitution and understanding of how we'll proceed as a country, that the government can be wrong and that we can amend the government when it's wrong, because we recognize when it's wrong by virtue of when it is violating right to life or right to liberty, because those things are rights that each individual holds. So realpolitik had limitations because it was all about the pursuit of power. And then all of a sudden the rubber met the road afterwards with World War II, when we realized the pursuit of power and the recognition that a state can pass whatever laws they want as long as those laws serve that state, put us in a position where we had no ability to condemn what Germany was doing outside of recognizing natural law that was pre-constitutional, pre-governmental, that they ought to have recognized that no matter what the laws of Germany said, you can't do those things to other human beings. And then if a government tells you to do it, it's illegitimate. And that you ought to have known better. You ought to have greater moral clarity. And so you're still condemnable even though you didn't violate any laws. Because natural law is pre-governmental. So realpolitik had its limits, and that the naked pursuit of power brought us the most monstrous regime that's ever existed. So that gets us now to just war theory. And where pacifism elevates peace and realpolitik elevates power, just war theory elevates justice. And here we go back, I think, somewhat to what I was talking about with being Treebeard. If we recognize that there is a time and place that a nation may need to go to war in order to limit profound evil, like the spread of fascism across Europe and the world, if we recognize that there is great evil being practiced and that we have the power and the ability to intercede, and that our intercession can be effective towards bringing an end or a limit to that evil, then under certain conditions, we can go to war. And as I said, the book is focused on terrorism, so because terrorism introduces a new element, right? And this is what you see, whatever your view about what's going on in Gaza and Israel, this is what you see, the struggle that Israel was fighting. And I mentioned this before on the show. Hamas is a recognized terrorist organization. When I was listening, that's not just in the United States, and that's just not propaganda. I listened to BBC radio. Every time, when this whole thing started after October 7th and for the execution of the war going forward, every time on BBC radio where they did a story about what was going on, they prefaced the story by saying it's important that you recognize that Hamas is a recognized terrorist organization by the government of England. The United Kingdom sees them as a recognized terrorist organization. That's what they are. They're not a nation. And that's what she said, because that time she's talking about Al-Qaeda and Taliban. This is like the thing that these people, the trouble that they bring to the table is that they're not a state. States can be expected to act in their interest. There are limits to which states will do certain things because states know that to cross certain lines will be the end of the state. Terrorist organizations aren't held by that same rule. You'll hear this when you talk. And so those three things, let's go back for a moment. I want to be very clear about that. Peace above all, power above all, justice above all. And so our evaluating the appropriate responses of nations will always be seen in just war theory through the lens of justice. Is justice being served? Not does it bring peace, not does it establish power, but is it just? Is justice being served? So the two principles that she talks about in order to demonstrate whether or not, or to evaluate whether or not our actions are just, would be proportionality and discrimination. She would say proportionality means the response that you have is proportional to the offense against you. And discrimination, and this is the most important, one of the most important aspects of just war theory, that you discriminate against legitimate military targets, legitimate military targets, and legitimate agents of war and civilians. And this came up funny. It's interesting. I think I was talking to a young man, and he shared a discussion in their class where somebody was, and this particular person was talking about was against Israel and all this, and talking about that Israel was targeting civilians. And my son said, well, I mean, there is evidence, and Israel's broadcast into there, they're going to attack particular areas and give people time to get out. They tell them that they're going to be executing there. So if you're there, and this happened, by the way, in the Iraq War, if you read about how the United States waged it, they told people we're going to be in this area. So if you were there, you are considered a combatant, right? Everybody that's in the streets will be considered a combatant if we're there. There should be no civilians in this city. We have warned you that the war is coming to this city. When we get there, if we see you in the streets, we're going to assume first that you're a combatant because we have given you time to get out. We've told you to leave, that we're going to be there, and we don't want to kill you. And we don't want to have to figure out whether you're a combatant or civilian, because that's really difficult to do in urban warfare. And that's what Israel is doing. So Israel is telling these places, we're going to be coming into that area. If you are not a combatant, then you need to not be in that area, because it's difficult for us to tell the difference between a civilian and a combatant in urban warfare. And that's what we're in the middle of, fighting in cities. So he said, they're doing that. It seems like they're doing that. The guy said, but they're targeting children. And he said that the guy made a statement as they were discussing this in the conversation. He said, what Israel is doing is unconscionable. It may be. And we're going to get to some in a second later. I don't know the idea that we can never know these things. He said, so like in the United States, we went to war, but we never targeted civilians. My friend was like, you sure about that? You might want to check on some of the things that we've done in the past. Now, what's interesting is, as my son was pointing out, I love the United States. I'm a patriot. I consider myself a patriotic young man. I love the principles this country was founded on. I also, because I'm going from a principle of just war, I'm capable of seeing when my own country, whom I love, is violating the principles of just war and condemning it. Because the highest level of concern isn't the power of my country or the peace of its citizens, but that we act in accordance with justice. And when we treat those who are fighting against unjustly, if we target civilians, intentionally target non-combatants, then we have violated the principles of just war and ought to be condemned for that practice. Which is why the practice of what we're seeing Israel doing, where they say, you need to leave. You need to get out. Now, this creates other problems. And this is where we're going to get to this. So the proportionality, let's address proportionality first, because she addresses in there, it would be wrong to look at proportionality if you're going off of a just war theory as if they killed 1,700 people on October 7th, then we can only kill 1,700 people in response. So that's not how proportionality works. Particularly, she says, with terrorist regimes. And she talks about the Taliban. She said, so because the Taliban harbored the terrorist who attacked us on September 11th, and because they were going to continue to harbor people that were going to launch other attacks, then we were justified in waging war against the Taliban, not against the non-combatant civilians of Afghanistan, but against the Taliban. And so, as she says, as the execution of that war goes forward, it would be wrong to say, well, they killed 3,000, so we can kill 3,000 of them, and then we're even. Because she says to measure, you can't measure the evil of an organization like the Taliban through that lens. If an evil organization exists and they are working evil, we can't just measure how many lives we've killed of theirs versus how many lives they killed against us, because there are other goods that can be preserved by the elimination of the Taliban. For example, women could live free again, perhaps, in that area. Not to be treated as property, not to be given away as children, not to be forced to wear burqas that cover their entire body, not to be raped, which is something that was routinely going on in that culture, where they were giving child brides over to people who were married to them for these short-term periods. And if you see it on the video versus if you're listening to this audio, as I say child bride or marriage, I'm using air quotes there, my little finger quotes there, because that was their moral justification for sexually abusing young people and then just discarding them and divorcing them or ending the marriage, however you want, giving them away. Abuses that most Americans couldn't even conceive of were happening on a regular basis under the Taliban rule. She said millions and millions of people living in desperate conditions because they live under the hegemony and control of a terrorist organization. And we have to think about them as far as the proportionality of our response. If their evil has risen to the level that we have to intercede, then it may be that we have to face some uncomfortable numbers in order to establish justice, which ought to be our aim. Limit evil, establish justice. So she said proportionality can't just be measured in this idea of your number and our number have to be close to each other. It has to be measured in the idea that in pursuit of justice, we may be required to do a lot against combatants in order to limit their evil and establish justice in a place where they have brought injustice. And so that the numbers that we're talking about are not just our own, but those people who live under the control of that violent regime. So she said, first of all, understand proportionality. We can't think just in equal numbers. Now she gets to discrimination, and that's where we talked a little bit about before, discriminating combatants versus non-combatants, and how we do that and how we practice that, and the difficulty that comes with that. And the idea that in order to pursue a just war, we have to take that very seriously. We can't just wipe them out. I hear so many of my friends say that every time something happens in the Middle East, let's just turn the whole place into glass. Let's just nuke it and destroy it all and start over. Well, sure, that's an option. A monstrously immoral, genocidal option, but it is an option. Because we have to recognize that there are victims of the evil that existed before we were victimized. And that we have to see the people that we're trying to help. For example, and this goes into the trouble with discrimination. I want to talk about that for a moment as far as the last thing we're going to talk about. And this goes to why I think it is so reckless to feel like you have to make a decision on whose side you're on. And that's what I'll close with. But let's talk about discrimination. It's difficult for those who are responsible for waging war to make that discrimination. And they're required to, in pursuit of a just war, to do so. It's hard for them. If you read the accounts of what happened in Baghdad or for what was going on in Afghanistan, and years from now, we'll hear about the accounts of what's going on in Gaza. The difficulty, if they are pursuing a just war, and it's a qualified, if you are pursuing a just war, the difficulty in determining who is a combatant and who is a non-combatant can be overwhelmingly hard. For those people who actually have intelligence and understand what's going on and are seeing what's happening in the streets, if it's hard for them, it is impossible for us to judge it from the other side of the world. I cannot make a judgment about whether or not a just war is being waged from over here. It's just not possible. On multiple levels. Number one is I'm not privy to what's going on. I don't see it. And number two, the people who are giving me that information are oftentimes people who are are prejudiced. For example, where do we get the number that I think the most recent number I saw was 35,000 civilians have been killed through the operation of the war in Gaza? Is that right? Have you heard anything differently? Okay, well, 35,000 is the number I think, or somewhere around there that we've been given. But who gave us those numbers? Hamas. Hamas is actually the source of those numbers. Right? So the source of the numbers of who is giving to us is Hamas. Now, do we have reason to question whether or not Hamas's numbers are legitimate? Of course we do. Why? Because they're one of the people in the middle of this conflict and because they have reasons to exaggerate what's going on. Now, that in and of itself does not demonstrate that they have exaggerated. That just demonstrates that there's a reason to maybe question the numbers. But even more than that, they themselves have come out, according to the Jerusalem Post, and said, we can't verify about a third of those. Roughly a third of them cannot be verified by their own verification process. This isn't from an outside source saying, let me see how you're verifying these deaths. This is Hamas saying, by our own criteria for verifying fatalities, we cannot verify about a third of those numbers. We're not capable of it. But that's interesting information. Now, here goes the problem, though, of me being able to sort through what's going on. The Jerusalem Post. Isn't it the Jerusalem Post that we was? Let's see. They provided, well, I've searched all about it on the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. But then I looked at the different information they were, so these guys link the information for Hamas where they're sharing these press releases explaining that they can't account for a third of them. Here's the problem that I have. If I click those links, do you know what language they're written in? Not English. It's in Arabic. I don't read Arabic. So I want to figure out if Hamas has actually said that they can't verify it, as these articles say, and they provide links, but the links give me the press releases written in Arabic by Hamas. I would need somebody that reads the language that they released it in. By the way, this is the same as true of any video that you've seen where you see somebody. Let's go to the other side. There was a video of people chanting in Arabic, and it was relayed that they were chanting genocide to all the Jews. And this was on a college campus here in the United States. This was reported in a fact checker where they went and said, okay, well, we've turned that video over to actually people who speak Arabic and asked them what was being said there. And what was being said was, we see you, Israel, no Jewish genocide, meaning that you're not allowed to commit genocide without us seeing you. Now, this is not just verified by people who would be friendly to Hamas. It was verified by Jewish scholars who understand the language as well. Now, this is important to know that you may see something online that says X happened, and it didn't happen. And you may see somebody speaking in Arabic, and there is going to be a translation underneath them, and you may get outraged with what that translation says, and they may not have said that, or they may have. But if you don't speak Arabic and can't understand what they're saying, then there's no way for you to verify it. This goes back to the problem of discrimination, which is very difficult for those who are actually executing war, is impossible for those of us who are removed from it. We can't know what's going on over there with enough certainty to be morally outraged about anything except for those things that we have already known going into this. Except the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organization is accepted across the world by nations. The idea that they built tunnels underneath the people of Gaza so that when they launched attacks in Israel against the Israeli people, if the Israelis retaliated, they would multiply the deaths of the civilians. And then they could do exactly what they're doing. Now, none of this means that I know Israel's waging a just war. I don't know that. And I hear things out of there that are troubling. But I've learned there's no way for me to know what's going on the ground there. I can't trust the numbers that are being given out by Hamas. I can't trust the information that's being shared. And here's my final. So that goes to so proportionality. We talked about that, and discrimination, the difficulty in discrimination. And because of those things, this is the last thing I want to talk about. A pastor friend of mine recently said he was struggling with this. He said, I don't know who to support. I don't know who the good guy is. I don't know if Israel is acting in good faith. I don't know if they're waging a just war. I don't know if that guy will tell you, I don't even know if a just war is possible. I don't know if Hamas is everything that I've been told. I don't know if protesting on the campus is supporting Hamas. He was telling me, I just don't know whose side that I'm on. And this goes back to my Treebeard thing. I reached out to him, and he and I had a trade of information where I said, why do you think you need to know? Why do you think you need to be able to make a public pronouncement on this at all? As a pastor, as a Christian, I think that we can recognize that we hope that in the execution of whatever it is Israel feels like they must do to make their country safe from the threat of Hamas, that they are doing so justly. I think that we can know, though, that there's things that we won't know. When we say that Israel is killing aid workers, I've seen reports that and these were released by Al Jazeera, where they were doing, which has not going to be a pro-Israel organization, where interviews that Al Jazeera were doing with people on the ground, where they said it was Hamas that was killing aid workers and were killing those people that were seeking aid, and they were hoarding that stuff. And then when Israel was attacking Hamas and hitting legitimate military targets where they had hoarded the aid, that destroyed the aid that Hamas was trying to sell back to the people that it was meant to go to. And that was reported on Al Jazeera, not on something that would be otherwise friendly to Israel. And you would expect to be lying about it. Those were eyewitness testimonies that were being given by people in interviews with Al Jazeera, people who I assume understand what they were saying far better than I do because they actually speak the language in which those stories are being shared. All of this is too big. There's a great line in The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller's graphic novel, one of the greatest graphic novels ever written, ever made, ever created. Some of the Batman movies that we see have taken from The Dark Knight, different elements from year one in Dark Knight. Both Christopher Nolan and Zack Snyder's treatment of Batman have taken from both of those. But there's a great line where Commissioner Gordon is talking about how he came to terms with Batman. He's saying, because he said, on the one hand, he's a criminal. He's a vigilante. He's operating outside of the law. On the other hand, Gotham City was out of control. And he represents somebody that's willing to do what's necessary to stop it. He curbs crime. He serves good. He doesn't do it in a way that's legal. And he said he wrestled with this, and then he heard a story. He relays hearing a story that it was possible that Roosevelt knew about the invasion of Pearl Harbor before it happened, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And he shares this, and so I'm not getting into whether that's historically accurate or not. I'm just sharing this from the story from The Dark Knight Returns. And he said he wrestled with that. Would that have been okay? If it was true, and Roosevelt used that as justification to finally get America animated enough to get involved in World War II and limit the evil and the spread of Nazi Germany, to effectively become part of the force that ended the tyranny of Hitler and the expansion of the Japanese in the Pacific. He said so much good, so much restraining of evil was done. And if Roosevelt knew that that was what was necessary to animate the people of the United States to get them involved and let it happen, he's thinking utilitarian-wise. Was that good? Was that bad? And he ultimately came to this decision. He said, I finally decided it was too big for me. Meaning that he wasn't capable of coming to a moral decision on it because he just didn't understand everything involved and couldn't pass judgment on Roosevelt without knowing what Roosevelt did or did not know. And if he did know it, not knowing the ultimate cost. From a utilitarian position, he was saying, was it ultimately a good, even if Roosevelt did lie and allow it to happen? He said, it's all too big for me. And I think that there's something there, and you realize in Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, and we had Jeffrey Bilbro on here to talk about redeeming the times, I think is what it is. But and we talked about this idea of non-actionable information. There are things that we can hear about in the world that are morally disturbing to us, but they're not happening to me, and they're not happening in a place where I can impact it or change it. And because I know so much more than I ever knew, than any human being ever knew in history, I'm capable of having an immediate experience of terrible things that are happening all over the world. I feel like I have to be able to say something, to do something. And the powerlessness that comes with knowing that you can't do anything to stop what's going on. Because of the technology in the world that we live in, we are witnesses to terrible events. And I mean this both on the world stage and I mean even personally. I can tell you one of the hardest things that ever happened to me as far as dealing with social media was very early on as I was becoming acquainted with Facebook. I saw a woman, someone on my friend list shared a story of a young man, young boy, a child who had cancer, who was fighting cancer. And as they kept sharing these posts, I can remember the moment that I turned and looked at my wife and I said, I don't think I'm strong enough to witness this young man die of cancer. Because that's what's happening. Someone I don't know is going through something unimaginably terrible. And this miracle of modern technology has made me a witness to it. And I don't know if I can do that because this won't be the end of it. Because I am going to have to see terrible things over and over and over again. And I can't stop any of it. And I don't know as a Christian how I'm supposed to steel myself for this new reality of a world that I live in, where I can immediately access evil and struggle and pain and suffering in a way that nobody ever has throughout all of human history. And how do I process that into my daily life? How do I not become paralyzed by the terrible things that are happening a world away from me? And that may stop me from loving my neighbor as myself today. Someone in my life may need me there, and I become overwhelmed by things that I cannot change and are incapable of doing in my life what needs to be done because I am overwrought with pain and emotion about things that I cannot impact or change. As I reached out to that pastor, I said, it seems to me that it's perfectly legitimate to pray for the people in Gaza who are innocent victims in all of this, who are victims of Hamas, and for whom they're just trying. I remember hearing a story on BBC Radio about a guy who, prior to all of this, he wasn't doing anything nefarious. He actually was he started a club to try to teach people in Gaza, Palestinians, to swim, because he said almost none of them can swim and drowning's a real problem there. And he had this school and he was teaching 100 kids every morning how to swim. And it was changing this little culture, and people were going to the beach and swimming and having more fun because they weren't afraid, because they could swim and they weren't going to die in the water. And he talked about how that was lost through all of this. See, that guy's a victim. That's an actual non-combatant victim. And I can pray for him and everybody like him over there. And all of the people who have been caught up in this terrorist organization inviting the wrath of a nation looking to preserve and protect their borders and the people that live within them from somebody who has made it very clear that they're dedicated to destroying them. And that's one of the things that she talks about in the Just War Against Terror. She says, too oftentimes those of us in the United States and in the Western world who have progressive ideals and who see things as the advancement of technology and the advancement of society means the end of religion, won't take terrorists at their word for why they're doing things. She said, when Osama bin Laden said, I'm doing this because I hate the Western culture, I hate the Western way of life, and I want to see it destroyed, so many other people stepped up and said, no, that's not true. He's doing it because we did things to exasperate them. We did things to antagonize them because of our actions in Israel and in the Middle East. We created this monster, and now he's coming after us. And if we just didn't do those things, he wouldn't be attacking us. And she says, why don't you just believe him? He tells you exactly why he's doing it. And it's the same thing when we're talking about Hamas. When we talk about the victims of Gaza, don't stop believing Hamas. They've told you exactly why they do what they do. They've never been shy about their views of Israel. And as Israel seeks to hopefully seeks just conflict against them, and as we try to wrestle with what's going on, we should be praying for the victims of Hamas and the victims of what's going on right now in Gaza, that they will find safety and that they will find peace. That when this war is executed, that it will be over, and that when we see a just end to all of this, we should pray for everybody involved in this, that justice will reign, not peace, not power, but justice will reign. And we should refrain from believing that we have answers that we could not possibly have, because we're not capable of having the information necessary to make moral judgments and condemnations against particular people. We should act as if we are what we are, which is fairly ill-informed people on the other side of the world that cannot possibly impact what's going on over there. And does that mean that I want to leave beside the protest, whatever you want to call them on college campuses right now, for another discussion. We'll table that and talk about it later, because I believe in the free exercise of protest, but the question then becomes, what becomes legitimate protest, right? The right to peaceably assemble is protected. But peaceable assembly ends when you start barring other people from living their normal daily life. That's not peaceable any longer. That's actually, you're forcing them to not be able to do the things that they want to do by virtue of your own ideals. And And as I think T.S. Eliot talked about in the Christianity and Culture, he talks about the idea of they think that their ideals are changing the world. Just by simply having those ideals, they're impacting or changing things. And we see this sort of thing with hashtag activism. So for us, what can we do? I think that we have to have some epistemic humility and recognize what we can and can't know. And then limit our most profound and deepest and angriest judgments for those things that we can know. And then to operate with some caution in other areas. And that's the great thing that I think just war gives us. Just war theory gives us the ability to evaluate and look and make decisions based on justice. If I am all in it for one side or another, if I feel like I have to pick one side or another, if I feel like they're the good guys and they're the bad guys and I can see that clearly all the time, then what's going to happen is I will excuse my side when they do things that don't serve justice. And I will miss the things that the people that I have said are them and the others do that might serve justice. So if my allegiance is to Christ and my idea of how we interact as a culture is the pursuit of justice, then I am able to see clearly when the people that I have allied myself with have violated the terms of agreement and the pursuit of justice. And condemn them as I would condemn anyone else. Because it's not you that I'm here for. It's Christ. And if we start to live out of accordance with the way that he would have us live, then I have to say something. And it's the same thing as we evaluate these things. The best that we can do is to gather information as best we can and to look out for very closely if even our friends may be crossing lines. And when they do, to be a friend to them and tell them that they've crossed lines. We shouldn't pretend that we know things that we don't know. And we certainly shouldn't pretend that things that we do know aren't so. And that goes back to Hamas. I cannot say this enough. Terrorists who want to destroy Israel and have never been shy about proclaiming that openly. They didn't become the good guys because you don't like what Israel's doing right now. They didn't become sympathetic. The people who are victims first of them. And I've heard this reported from people who are not Zionist or for Israel, that they said, our aid was taken by them first. And that was where this started. So when we think about this and try to process what's going on, I just try to encourage people to get away from the idea that you have enough information on this side of the world to be able to have the discrimination necessary to make these judgments. Proportionality, discrimination. Those are the two most important facets about pursuing just war. And as we watch a nation and pray that they are pursuing just war, and then let's take not knowing what or not is going on and having the inability, as I've already demonstrated, the impossibility of discerning all the different sources. You know where we can see with very clearly what's going on? Russia. Russia has invaded their neighbor. And they have made war against someone who is not an aggressor. And it just continues to go on and on and on. And there's no justice, no pursuit of justice. They're not fighting a just war. At no level do they meet that cause. There's no proportionality. There's no discrimination. There's just open warfare against your neighbor to bring them into the fold because they were threatening to do something that you didn't want them to do. But they're not your country. And you don't get to tell them what they can or can't do out of your own fear. So we can see that's what unjust war looks like 100%. So let's look at what's going on here and see if we can do a better job at discerning as best we can what's going on and not feel that we have to pick a side, but that justice is the side that we've chosen. I've chosen the justice of Christ. And I see that the Bible tells me that he put the sword in the hand of nations so that they can bring justice. And as I see the execution of that, I need to see clearly as best I can whether or not even my friends are acting as they should. Even my own nation is acting as it should. And when my own nation or my friends are not acting as they should, then I do have to have the courage to stand up and speak out on what I know, when I know it. That's it. We're done for the day. So, in a nutshell, I mourn the passing of Hall & Oates. I worry about Gladis's pod of Orcas. I'm hoping that as they escalate, that I don't know what the response is going to be. I can't imagine the sailing community is going to take this as well as the scientific community is. The scientific community sees this as a curiosity. Let's see how far this goes. I feel like sooner or later the sailing community in the Gibraltar area is going to get sick of Gladis and her 15 orcas, and I fear what happens after that for them. Banning books, bad librarians, we covered that. And the introduction of the idea of just war theory, the idea of differentiating between peace at all costs, power at all costs, justice at all costs. And how I think the third of those puts us in the best position to deal with the world as it is without being consumed with tribalism. That's just my personal view. And the idea that in order to wage just war, we operate on two principles, proportionality and discrimination. Proportionality doesn't necessarily mean you killed this many, so I kill that many. And discrimination opens up the most difficult part when you're dealing with a terrorist organization and urban warfare. This isn't happening on the fields. This is happening in the cities. And it's difficult to discern who's your friend and who's not. I encourage you to read stories about what are going out of there with an open eye to the idea of how difficult this is, what we're seeing there. And also, I applaud all of the relief. I applaud relief agents that are agencies that are trying to get in there and to help and do the best that they can to help people that are in crisis right now. I applaud all of the efforts to get food and water and medical services to the people, to the victims of all of this, who I think are primarily first victims of Hamas, and then ultimately a victim of the conflict that was begun on October 7th. And I applaud everybody out there who is praying for those people and doing their best to find ways to help them in any way that they can. And I think that it is just a tragedy of the miracle of the modern, with the upside of knowing the horrible things that are going on is we're able of mobilizing in ways that we never were before. The downside of it is that we're able to feel things that we were never able to feel before for people that are enduring terrible things and to have to do so in a powerless condition oftentimes. All right, so that's the end of today. As always, merelyhumanministries.org is our website. Find us on Facebook, find us on Instagram. You can find us on Twitter. I think we're on TikTok, but we're not really on TikTok. X, formerly known as Twitter. Let's be official on that, right? So Instagram, X, and Facebook for sure. Website, merelyhumanministries.org. You can give there if you like our content. Thank you so much for all the people listening. Have a blessed and great day.